It's time for the Douglas Coleman Show. Mr. Smooth and Savvy is joined by guests from all walks of life, from the entertainment industry to authors to political and social commentators, the famous and not so famous, the controversial and the light and fluffy. We have it all. Now, here's Douglas Coleman.
Okay. Hi, Bob. How are you?
I'm doing well, Douglas.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
It says on your bio that you have been a teacher, a lawyer, and a Texas district judge. Are you retired from all of those now?
Yes, sir. I retired from the bench 12 years ago.
Okay. That must have been an interesting career for you, yeah?
It was pretty interesting. My dad was a doctor, and I couldn't do math and physics and chemistry, so I had to settle for being a lawyer.
What was your most famous case?
There's several. You got criminal and you got civil, but I guess criminal is when you would have in a murder case where a guy was allowed to testify, and he was testifying and he got caught. And it was about, you only see in 20 years about one or two Perry Mason moments. But when you see a Perry Mason moment, you say, they really do happen. And so that was interesting.
Oh, so he pled innocent, and then he sort of incriminated himself on the stand?
Exactly. And I saw that on an arson case one time.
Oh.
I thought the lawyer, who was a former professional football player and All-American college football player, got real mad at his client for lying to him. And, that worked out in the plea real fast in the middle of trial.
Well, let me ask you something, because you were a lawyer as well as a judge. I assume that you've probably had clients that were guilty, even though they said they weren't, right?
Goes both ways.
Yeah.
I think probably the question many times, you have actual innocence cases. If a case is based, say, on eyewitness testimony alone, if you've ever hollered at somebody thinking it was your friend and realized later, no, it wasn't, then that tells you why you do have some actual innocence cases. But you also have cases that are, most of them are guilty of something. The question is, are they guilty as charged, or are they guilty of a lesser offense? And sometimes one side or the other asks for what they call a lesser included offense. But you see, it's human beings, and they're our flawed natures, so you see it all.
Well, and I think that our justice system, although it's not perfect, is pretty good in the sense that we do have degrees of guilt where it's
right.
not a one-size-fits-all and the court has
Exactly.
to decide. And I think that that's fair in implementing justice.
The weakness is not the system. The weakness is the human beings that are part of the system.
Exactly. Now, I've always been curious about this, and maybe you would have an answer for me. But when you're talking about murder in the first degree versus murder in the second degree, my understanding is that it's premeditation is the criteria for that. Is that correct?
Right. Pretty much. There's 3 or 4 different inmates, they call it different things. But capital murder is a little different because it's always intentional, and it's killing a police officer, a child, or more than one child. It's got odd components, but most of the time the other subspecies of murder have to do everything from negligent homicide on up to murder. And that you got it right.
Okay. So with a second degree murder charge, that would be like heat of passion, moment of where you just lost control of yourself, but you really had no intention. You didn't set out that day to go kill that person, right?
I don't have the penal code in front of me, or don't know what it says where you are, but I would say that's pretty right. There's probably the majority. A lot of murders are there's either alcohol or female that the man. It's usually men commit murders. Although women do commit murders, but it's either jealousy or mixed with alcohol or drugs or something of that nature. A lot of them.
Right. Okay. You retired from all of that. How long have you been retired?
I've been retired since last of 2010.
Okay, so
December 31st, yeah.
about 12 years, yeah.
A little over 12 years.
Okay, and in the meantime, you've written a children's book. Is this your first one, or have you written more?
No, when my son, who's now 43, when he was, 6 or 7 or 5 or somewhere in there, I noticed that the stories that we were buying just didn't have much story in them. They had animals being naughty, and that was supposed to be funny, and they were excellently produced, but I thought I could do better, so I started making up stories to tell him. My wife overheard me and said, you should get that published. And so I found an illustrator, and I got a publishing contract, and we wrote 2 stories, one in 87 and one in 88. And interestingly enough, they didn't deal with rabbits, they dealt with hares, jackrabbits. A jackrabbit is actually a hare in the hare family. But that was a long time ago now, and when I became a judge in 90, I just couldn't see myself selling children's books while meting out justice on the bench. Cranked it back up at the instance of my sister-in-law.
Oh, I see. Okay. I haven't read children's books in a long time, and I know that the classics are always good, the old ones. And I think as a kid, my favorite animal probably was Lassie. So,
yeah,
I remember those stories, a lot of the Disney stories and things, but I don't know, the new ones, so much of it is computer animated these days.
I'm with you 100%. I illustrated my last book for that exact reason. Not that they're not great illustrations, but number one, I didn't have the ability to do the computer illustration, and number two, the organic feel of a handwritten book.
Yeah, I like the illustrations. They look good.
Well, this guy died, and he was a wonderful man, and he also wrote this second one, Papa and Elizabeth, a Bobtail Romance. And I'll say this for you. I'm proud of one thing. They all have a story in them. To me, a children's book, they're worthy of literature, worthy of a real story. And so that's what I try to do. And then the new one that was 34 years later, so is The Storm with Big Bunny and Little Bunny.
So when you say there's a real story in it, is it a moral story? Is there a point to it?
They're kind of a cross between a tall tale and a reality tale, like Aesop's Fable, that had a point in the end. The idea that was in my mind is that, or as I've come to think of it, is that we're all taught some values, good or bad, but for values, they have to be sort of demonstrated, and then they have to be evaluated. And if a child early on receives stories that conflict in them, and they have value, they have a crisis that is averted by virtue or by someone doing the right thing, then that's a good outcome. And they deal with things like the first book was like competition and sportsmanship. The second book dealt with love, and strangely enough, a wounded veteran that loses his special, unique gift and has to come back out of that. And love has part to do with that. So they're teaching real things in a positive way that show that most of the time, if you do the right thing, it's going to be rewarded.
All right. So are all of the books out and available? They're all published, yeah?
I have them on Amazon, on Walmart, online, all online, and Barnes and Nobles. And every day I'll find a new outlet that they are coming out on.
Okay, great. Do you plan on writing any more?
Right now I'm writing an adult story. And so I think after I get that one done, I'm just in maybe 20 pages in, but I have the story in my mind. And if it's a goal to write a real book, adult type book before I go on to the great beyond, but I'll probably come back and do a sequel to this last story, The Scary Storm with Big Bunny and Little Bunny. But most of my stories kind of spontaneously jump into my head, the basic plot of the story and the outline. So I don't sit there and say I'm going to write a story. It has to jump into my head more or less. and then it's a matter of writing it out.
All right. Well, we do have to wind this down. Do you have a website that you want to give out?
Yes, authorbobmay.com. Authorbobmay.com will get you there.
Okay, and that's got all your books there and information about you. And
it's got the books. It has buy places where you can find them and descriptions of what we're about, what we're doing.
All right, great. Well, Bob, thanks so much for coming on the show. It was nice talking to you, and best of luck with your books.
Talking.
You're listening to Mr. Smooth and Savvy right here on the Douglas Coleman Show. We'll be right back after these commercial messages.
Douglas Coleman's Don't Do a Podcast is a dryly humorous rant about Douglas's pet peeve, the unrelenting torrent of podcasts hitting the web on a constant basis. As technology has put podcasting within the reach of anyone, many wholly unqualified people have taken the plunge. This witty polemic tries to persuade them from broadcasting their drivel using Douglas's brand of sarcastic humor. Now on Amazon, only 99 cents.
DJC Music and DJC Productions are pleased to announce a brand new website. We have started a listing website for radio show hosts as well as potential show guests. This is a meeting site where hosts and guests can come together. Show hosts can list their show and types of guests they're interested in booking. Potential guests can list their talents, bio, accomplishments, or anything they feel makes them an interesting radio show guest. There are no recurrent payments, only a one-time $5 listing fee. Your listing will stay up until you decide to cancel. Previous guests of The Douglas Coleman Show are welcome to submit their guest listing free of charge. Go to radiohostsandguests.com. That's radiohostsandguests.com.
Are you an independent musician? How would you like to have your songs played on hundreds of radio stations just like the one you're listening to right now? Join MusicSubmit.com and we'll promote your music to radio stations and blogs in your genre. It's free to set up your account, and we guarantee your music will be considered for airplay by radio stations worldwide. Why not sign up today? It's free. MusicSubmit.com. Radio promotion for indie musicians.
Hey, this is Ray Powers. Don't touch anything. You've got it right where you need it. Tuned in to the Douglas Coleman Show. You heard me.
Okay, please welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show, Jason Murchie. Hi, Jason. How are you?
Hello. Good. Happy to be here.
Oh, thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
So your book is called Wisdom, yeah?
Indeed. It's a topic that I've had a strange interest in for quite some time. Especially the way that it interacts with things like personal growth and success, things like that. But just in general, the subject fascinates me.
Well, I think for the sake of this conversation, let us define wisdom first.
Darn it, I was hoping you wouldn't ask that. I say that tongue in cheek, but it is a little complicated to, put a good definition to. That's kind of the case with all of the values and the virtues, if you think about it. When I started this enterprise called Values of the Wise, 2004, I was interested in what honor is. And, of course, when you look at the word honor up in the dictionary, you get a kind of a thin definition, I guess you would say. So, it's interesting to think about how you would define something. But, it's very broad. It's very deep. It's a little elusive, a little complex. I think some of the ways to approach it would be, using, examples and case studies and such. But if I had to, answer your question specifically, it's like seeing things clearly, having a deep understanding of things, maybe an inner knowing, being able to process emotions successfully and integrate them with your thinking, anticipating problems and coming up with, decent solutions. Prudence is kind of a decent synonym. Okay. How does that work for you?
Yeah, that's all right. I think that a lot of people equate wisdom with age, and that's always been the old saying, you get wiser with age. It's not necessarily true, okay? I see it, I think, more often with people who are older, that they have become wise in some regard. And I see it more often with younger people that they have not. But it's not. But I've also seen the opposite. I've seen some really stupid people who were 60 plus years old, and some really, really bright, wise people who were barely in their 20s. So it's not exclusive to age.
It's interesting. One thing that comes to mind is that in those retirement communities where people are still active and playing shuffleboard and having cocktails and stuff, the people who run those places, there's a known issue in many of them, and it is that the people who live there trade STDs back and forth, and so it's like you have to do a little intervention with your residents where you're like, all right, listen, people, STDs are a serious thing, and a lot of you have them, so please, practice safe sex. And these people are 60, 70, 80, 90, so they kind of got this STD lecture a number of years ago, let's say 50 years ago, and it's just interesting. So, but obviously, if you think about someone like the Dalai Lama or Gandalf, Tolkien's character, so on and so forth, you get the impression, and it's reasonable, that you can't just be a spring chicken and really have the kind of deep knowledge that really kind of transmutes into wisdom over time. And that's why parents, obviously parents usually in their 30s, 40s, 50s, they try to communicate to their teenager, sit them down and you're like, please listen to me. If you do such and such, it's going to be so problematic for you. Why don't you understand? And teenagers like, I just really want to do it. Can I give it a shot? My friends are doing it, please. And the parents, essentially what they would be saying to the teen could be translated as, what you're planning to do seems unwise to us as your elders, people who've been around the block a number of times. We feel like it's going to fail and you're going to experience pain. But sometimes you can't teach wisdom in that sense. You have to just sort of advise somebody and then let them take a shot at it. And so, I think age is a necessary but insufficient precursor or base for making wise decisions in life.
Well, while you were mentioning the Dalai Lama and
Gandalf,
yeah, okay, I thought of Aslan from Narnia.
Exactly.
Yeah, he came off as a very wise lion. And it's an interesting concept because it also begs the question, is wisdom learned or is it an inherent talent? And I think more than not it's learned because you get it through life experience. At least speaking personally for me, when I was 20 years old, I had zero wisdom, I think. And I think I have a lot more of it now that I'm going to be 60. And
congrats.
It really came through life experience more than anything else. It was just doing things over and over again, working in a job, experiencing the same things happening to me that would terrify me when I was young. But then when I got older, I was like, that's just the way it is. And you brush it off.
Right.
You also, and maybe this is part of becoming wise, is that I've found that as one gets older, we redefine our priorities. What was important to me at 20 is not important to me now.
That's true. I think if you look into the psychological research, you do get the understanding that as people age, they get closer to death, basically. And there's a phenomenon called time horizons where they sort of, to the degree that they are wise, they get that life is sort of like, watching sand flow through an hourglass. And therefore, they do have the ability to, sort of focus the mind on ends that are consistent with their highest values. So, for example, they might quibble less with their neighbor over, the trash cans being put out too early or whatever, because they think to themselves, I don't really care about that. I'm going to be dead in 10 years. So what matters to me is, fill in the blank, my grandchildren, retiring early, traveling, making a difference, things like that. And, when you're young, you have different goals. Your development is let's say, at a lower level. And so therefore, your top tasks might be to, have your brain mature. The human brain doesn't really mature all the way until mid-20s, believe it or not. Maybe you're interested more in finding a mate or educating yourself or getting a good job. And when you're older, you start to realize, hey, what are the things that really matter in life, and how can I achieve them? And I would say at one of the highest levels is, how can I leave a legacy, talking about significance and meaning and purpose and things like that. And so these things kind of come to you more when you are ready to receive them.
Well, I agree. And a line from a Billy Joel song is coming to my head where he said, I once believed in causes too and had my pointless point of view, and life went on no matter who was wrong or right. I think I learned that along the way. That's not to say you shouldn't take an interest in what's going on in the world. But when I see these protesters who are primarily young that are, throwing rocks through shop windows because of a police shooting or because of a debate in the Supreme Court over abortion or whatever it is, I'm not taking a particular side on the topics. I'm just suggesting that kind of reaction or that sort of a protest is in the end not really going to help you, because I can promise that things won't change as a result of that.
Right. Well, reactivity would be the psychological term for what you're describing. And as you get older, I do, and wiser, let's say, I do think that you begin to have a better capacity to think things through and imagine consequences that might come down the line. And, it's not a terribly bad definition of wisdom to say that it's an efficient perception of what will happen in the future if this path versus that path is taken. And of course, you're correct that, to become violent and irrational and so on in a protest that's not really the purpose of a protest. If you look into nonviolent resistance and the concept, it doesn't involve pummeling your opponents with a rock successfully. So I definitely hear you on that. And things can happen in groups that are, it's amazing if you look at social psychology, things like the Stanford prison experiment and so on. If you're in a group and those pressures start to kick up, it can be amazing what you might do. So clearly just being a part of a protest that starts to go sideways is problematic, because now you're not able to think in the same exact way as you would if you were, sitting quietly in a room, let's say.
Well, that's true. And I think it takes somebody wise that if a peaceful protest turns violent, to walk away. And that usually doesn't happen. You don't see that. Right. You see them sort of get sucked into the mob mentality, and they end up picking up a rock and throwing it through a window or throwing it at someone's head, rather than saying, well, I know this is not right, I should just go.
Yeah,
caught up in the moment, whatever you want to call it.
It's one of the few potential, I would say maybe possible, purposes of a prison sentence is to cause the person to reconsider what act they took, and typically those acts that land you in jail that are sort of in the realm of passionate and impulsive, violent, things like that, jealousy, things like this. You can see the way that the emotion works, and it's very interesting, right? The way that, I can imagine you would have so many hours if you were in prison and you let's say killed your cheating lover or something. You would probably be facing an eternity of regret, thinking, damn, I wish I didn't do that. if I could just go back, I would try to control my emotion and say, you know what, I'm divorcing you tomorrow. And that would just be a much wiser course than to act out and quote, when people say they, quote, see red, it means that their emotional brain has become activated to such a degree that the other parts of their brain, the parts that are more evolutionarily recently developed, are sort of offline temporarily, and you're kind of acting on instinct. And that can be good if you are, let's say, fleeing from a saber-toothed tiger, right? You don't want to think about what you should be doing. You want to do it, and you want adrenaline to help you and so on. But in most instances people find themselves in nowadays, there's really no running from saber-toothed tigers. It's in the example I shared, it's, you didn't have to kill your lover, but you did because you were angry enough to do so, and your wisdom was so diminished that you didn't see the outcome.
Right, exactly. Let me change the focus a little bit here to your books. Now, it says on your bio that this is your 4th book. Were your first 3 books also on the subject of wisdom?
Yeah, they were different. I think one of the things that interested me about wisdom when I, started to read about it, write about it, rewrite, get it proofed, rewrite, on and on and on, is, the pandemic, having a fair amount of time to think about things. And I was also very disconcerted with the way society has been going in however long. I could probably say 75 years or maybe 5 years, depending on, what frame you want to use. But certainly the last 5 years have been disconcerting and difficult for me. And frankly, I think almost every American would say, if they thought about it, things are just not right. In fact, I was reading Ken Burns, the famous documentarian.
Sure.
He's a very reasonable fellow, has a huge amount of experience, and he feels like this is the hardest time, the most difficult experience America has ever had right now. And that's amazing because he knows we've been through the Civil War, fighting Nazis, Great Depression, all these different things. And now he says he's the most worried for America.
All right. Hold on to that thought for a second. I want to figure out why he thinks this is the worst time. We had a sort of a compound problem in the last few years between the great political divide in this country and a pandemic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay. We've had a pandemic. I mean, the last big one was the Spanish flu, but we didn't have a huge political divide at that point. We had some, but I don't think it was to this degree. We've had bigger political divides. Certainly the Civil War was a huge political divide. And the one that a lot of people forget about is during the American Revolution, there was a huge political divide. I don't mean between us and Britain, but between fellow Americans.
You're right.
Because half of them fled to Canada and said, no, we're still loyal to the king. We're starting our own country. So they just left. And then there was a lot of debate going on at that time whether or not we should engage in war with the most powerful army on the earth at the time, and a bunch of ragtag patriots. But the point being is, why do you think that he feels that, or did he say, that right now is the most terrible time? What was his reasons for that?
I probably would have to look it up. I feel like it was in a famous magazine like The New Yorker or something, and can be easily found. But if memory serves, it was, this schism between Americans. There's a big difference between Americans being united in solving a problem versus not even agreeing on the nature of the problem, or blaming the other side for the problem, or looking down your nose at the other side for utterly failing to handle the problem. If you think about World War II, little kids would bring in a little metal toy and throw it in the smelter or whatever that thing was called, as a way to contribute to fighting the Nazis, and they felt great about that. I mean, there were no people who would stand there and heckle them and say, look at this kid, he's throwing his little airplane in the smelter, what an idiot. There's no there's no war in Europe, or we shouldn't be involved in it. You know what I mean? It's like once we were engaged by the Japanese, it became everybody focused on that. Probably in the sense that can be criticized, doing things like mistreating German Americans and Japanese Americans because we were so passionate about the war and so paranoid about losing the war. And then as you say, the pandemic, we've lost 1 million people in the pandemic, more or less, as of this recording, and that's an astonishing number. And if numbers, if statistics can be trusted, then one should look at 1 million people and be deeply disturbed by that, because if you think about it, in the Civil War, we only lost 600,000, I think. So we've done a terrible job of avoiding death in this pandemic. And there might have maybe environmental threats was another one, maybe debt. I'm forgetting, but he was not optimistic. He was not resigned. He's not planning to go to Canada and live, but he felt like we really need to pull this one out. If it's the fourth quarter, we're down by 14.
Well, I think for me personally, it certainly feels like it's the most troubling time. I was a little kid during the 1960s when we had a lot of civil unrest, but we didn't have a pandemic.
Yeah.
And we had a great economy through the 60s. See, we do have a lot of things going on right now. Inflation. In the 1960s, the economy was roaring with almost zero inflation and 30-cent gas that I remember as a kid, right? So the Vietnam War was a problem. The civil rights issues were a big problem. And the whole social revolution. But now it seems a little bit different. And I don't want to go there because we would get off topic. But
gotcha.
Let me bring this back to your book, and then we probably could wind this down. So what is the takeaway? I mean, the book is just entitled Wisdom. But if I pick it up and read it, what is it a self-help book? Is it a guide? Is it a map to find wisdom? Or what is it?
Well, I've been interested in applied philosophy and social psychology and clinical applied psychology for quite some time. And this is because I have a background in doing psychotherapy, in participating in psychotherapy as a client, trying to work on my own mental health. And so I guess in a sense, I'm interested in things, Socrates, Francis Bacon, Euripides, Pascal, things that most people don't, persons that most people don't necessarily want to read or consider to be relevant. But I think that all of those people who've come before us and who are, still alive today and wise can be invaluable teachers to us as we struggle through life with our own personal problems, relationship problems, community problems, national problems, worldwide problems. And so, these voices of wise people sharing what they, felt in such a heartfelt way is something that I don't think we should miss. And I think it can be very valuable in regard to personal growth.
So the book is a collection of other people's wisdom?
To use a musical term, I riffed on, some of the things that I was reading in the psychological research, literature, or something that a famous philosopher, Bertrand Russell or whoever, has said. Just if you give me a paragraph, and if the paragraph is about values, virtues, wisdom, ethics, something like that, I can get very excited about that, and then I can write about that or share my thoughts about that. And so I do have over 1,000 quotations in the book, but they're not necessarily all stacked up. I sort of I take an interesting topic, like let's say compassion or delay of gratification or critical thinking, and I just do a chapter on it, and I come at it from different angles. I try to bring in diverse perspectives, and I do try to share a lot of myself. To answer your previous question, the prior books really were more like quotations, essays, conversations with other people. This book has more of me in it, and that's because I felt like now's the time for me to speak up, lest if it's true that this is a very trying time for people, then if I don't speak up and share some of the things that I think can be helpful, then it's really I think it's selfish of me.
Well, okay. A trying time, again, is kind of relative to where you're starting from. Some people would have claimed that the polio epidemic in the 1950s that crippled so many children. But again, no war and a booming economy and a very united America. But somebody who lost a child's ability to be mobile, that could have been the most devastating time for them. So it is, I like Ken Burns. I've been a fan of his work for years. Is this the most trying time in the history of the United States? I suppose if he thinks that, that's fine. he has a right to his opinion. I don't know. I think for me, I would agree with that as well. I think this is probably the most challenging that I've ever seen. Hopefully there is something beyond all of this, because I think we are kind of at the end of it, like you said, the fourth quarter, or the fourth down rather. And I don't know. I don't see, couldn't get much worse, really.
I hear you. Obviously, Ukraine is something we haven't mentioned yet, which is just horribly scary. I mean, I've literally thought in the past few months, I wonder how likely it is that I would die in a nuclear inferno. You know what I mean? And that's something that, people usually don't have to cope with. That's a huge stressor for people, to think that there's a madman out there, doing a genocide against, decent people, and the rest of us can't really do much because he's nuclear armed. And it's, it's almost absurd. Humans are not great with dealing with stressors that they can't control. And many of the things that plague a lot of people nowadays are things that are hard to control.
Well, true. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think people experienced similar during the Missiles of October crisis in the early 60s. We were right. There was a lot of nuclear saber rattling at that point. But then it kind of calmed down. And this is really the first time since then, 60 years ago, that people are nuclear saber rattling again. And I think the fact that we have a president who just doesn't seem quite up to it is another scary thing. Now, we could take that in two different ways, because if I say that Biden seems he's a little bit frail, then on the other side, you don't want somebody who's going to match Putin's insanity, even if he has a full tank of gas, shall we say.
Right.
You need somebody sort of in the middle of those two, and
that's actually a good entree into like what is wisdom in the applied sense. Wisdom always tries to avoid polarities and extremes, tries to integrate different things.
All right.
And that can be looked at in the smallest sense, or in the the widest lens possible. Obviously, if you're talking about a president and a dictator, you're talking about a very wide lens, and of course, wisdom is the name of the game there. I mean, I'm sure Biden probably wakes up with nightmares and he thinks, "Oh God, grant me the wisdom to deal with this situation." I mean, talk about the pressure. And so wisdom is one of those things that underlies so much of everything, and yet it's almost kind of invisible. I feel that promoting this book, because people don't have a wonderful first impression of the concept of wisdom when they see the cover. Wisdom's written right across it, and I think a lot of people are like, I don't really know that subject. I don't know. I don't really want to get into that subject, and yet. Wisdom can be the difference, as we've been discussing, between nuclear annihilation versus successful outcome.
Well, okay. I think on that note, I think this is a good place to wind this down. My guest is Jason Murchie, and his latest book is called Wisdom. When was it released?
In February of 2022.
Okay, so just a couple of months. How's it doing?
Like I said, I advertise it on Amazon, and I get a lot of impressions per every click. And so I'm thinking, I guess people just don't really have they don't think about wisdom as a thing that they are interested in or that can be useful to them. And I guess I'm kind of here to say, no, it can be. It can underlie everything from happiness to fulfillment to meaning to success, and it can really drive a person's life to be much more in tune with their highest values if they just kind of knew more about wisdom and were inspired to put into practice some of the hallmarks of it.
Okay. Do you have a website you want to give out?
Yes, my website is called valuesofthewise.com. Values of the wise, essentially meaning what are the values that wise people are most interested in. And so I tend to claim that it's things like, wisdom, obviously, but other values that are some of these hallmark cardinal virtues, the courage and, goodness, love, creativity, humor, honor, all those types of things. Those things interest me, and there are some things that folks can do on the website that are free and advertisement free. So I would welcome them to see what Values of the Wise is about.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. It was nice meeting you and nice talking to you, and best of luck with the book. Hope it does well. I hope people heed the advice if they find any in the book. I think we could all use a bit more wisdom.
Hear, hear.